Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight we're stepping into a peculiar chapter of American history that most textbooks skip right over. We're talking about a state that existed for 4.5 years, had its own governor, passed its own laws, negotiated its own treaties, and paid government officials in raccoon pelts and beaver skins. This is the story of Franklin, the lost state that almost was. The ambitious experiment that rose from the chaos of post-revolutionary America and flickered out just as quickly, leaving behind nothing but questions, a few tattered documents, and one very confused spot on the map between North Carolina and Tennessee. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into forgotten corners of history, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm always amazed at how many of you tune in from around the world. Now settle in, maybe dim the lights, and let's travel back to 1784, when the United States was barely a teenager, still figuring out how to walk, and the frontier was a place where anything seemed possible, including inventing your own state from scratch. The year was 1784, and America was exhausted. The Revolutionary War had ended just a year earlier with the Treaty of Paris, and the 13 colonies, now calling themselves states, were trying to figure out what exactly they had won. They had independence, sure, but they also had massive war debts, a government held together by the Articles of Confederation that had all the authority of a strongly worded suggestion, and a sprawling wilderness to the west that nobody quite knew what to do with. The Appalachian Mountains formed a natural barrier, and beyond them lay thousands upon thousands of acres of land that the British had claimed, the Native Americans had lived on for centuries, and the new American states were now eyeing with a mixture of greed and trepidation. In the eastern cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, life was slowly returning to normal. But out west, beyond those mountains, settlers were pouring into territory that was nominally controlled by North Carolina and Virginia, but practically controlled by whoever had the biggest militia and the loudest voice. These weren't your genteel plantation owners or Boston merchants. These were tough, stubborn, self-reliant families who had looked at King George's proclamation of 1763, the one that said, "Don't you dare cross the Appalachians," and had basically responded with a collective shrug and kept walking. By 1784, tens of thousands of these settlers had established themselves in what is now eastern Tennessee. They built cabins, cleared land, planted crops, and tried not to get killed by the Cherokee, who understandably weren't thrilled about all these uninvited guests. The problem was, these settlers were technically residents of North Carolina, but North Carolina's government was over 300 miles away, across mountains that made communications slow, expensive, and dangerous. Getting a message to the capital could take weeks. Getting protection from Native American raids, that could take months, if it came at all. And that delay, that sense of being forgotten, ignored, and left to fend for themselves, is what planted the seeds of what would become the state of Franklin. See, North Carolina didn't particularly want these western lands. They were expensive to defend, difficult to govern, and full of people who kept starting fights with the Cherokee, which then required the state to send militia west to bail them out. But North Carolina also didn't want to just give the the land away for free. After all, land was the only real asset the cash-strapped state had. So the North Carolina legislature came up with a plan. A plan that was part financial desperation, part political maneuvering, and part outright corruption. And it set off a chain of events that would lead directly to the creation and eventual destruction of the state of Franklin. The Western Territory, a frontier in limbo. Let's paint a picture of this land, because understanding the geography helps explain why the people there felt so disconnected from the rest of North Carolina, and why they thought creating their own state made perfect sense. The territory we're talking about covered what is now the easternmost 12 counties of Tennessee, roughly 43,000 square miles of rugged, beautiful, and occasionally terrifying wilderness. The land was defined by rivers, the French Broad, the Holston, the Nolichucky, and the Tennessee. Waterways that served as highways in a region where roads were little more than trails carved through forests so dense you could walk for days without seeing the sun. The Appalachian Mountains formed the eastern boundary, a series of ridges and valleys that made travel to North Carolina a multi-day ordeal on horseback or foot. To the west flowed the Tennessee River, and beyond that, even more wilderness controlled by the Cherokee, Creek, and Chickasaw nations. To the north was Virginia, which had its own ideas about western expansion. And to the south, well, that was Cherokee country, protected by treaty, but increasingly encroached upon by settlers who either didn't know about the treaties or didn't care. The people who lived in this territory weren't wealthy aristocrats. These were farmers, hunters, traders, former soldiers, and families looking for land they could actually afford. Many had fought in the Revolutionary War and been promised land grants as payment. Others had simply heard that land was cheap or free if you could hold on to it, and they'd packed up everything they owned and headed west. They built log cabins, cleared fields, raised corn and livestock, and lived in a state of constant, low-level vigilance because raids from Cherokee war parties were a genuine possibility, especially as more settlers moved onto land that had been explicitly reserved for Native Americans by various treaties that the settlers either didn't know about or chose to ignore. The main population centers, if you could call them that, were clustered in 3 counties: Washington, Sullivan, and Greene. These weren't bustling cities. We're talking about scattered settlements, small towns with names like Jonesboro, which was the largest, and served as a kind of unofficial capital, and outposts like White's Fort, which would eventually grow into Knoxville. The total population was maybe 15 to 20,000 people, which sounds small until you realize that was more people than lived in some of the original 13 states at the time. These settlers had already proven they could govern themselves. Back in 1772, before the Revolution even started, a group of settlers had formed the Watauga Association, essentially creating their own local government because they were so far removed from colonial authority. It was a democratic system where leaders were elected, laws were passed, and disputes were settled without any help from a distant government. And it worked. The Watauga Association kept order, defended against raids, and even negotiated land purchases from the Cherokee. When North Carolina eventually absorbed the region, the Watauga system became the foundation for Washington District, and that tradition of self-governance stayed alive in the minds of the frontier people. They'd also proven they could fight. In 1780, a force of frontier militiamen, many from this exact region, had marched across the mountains to intercept a British force at Kings Mountain in South Carolina. In a battle that lasted about an hour, these frontiersmen, including a colonel named John Sevier, absolutely demolished the British force, killing or capturing nearly the entire enemy army. It was one of the turning points of the Revolutionary War, and it sent a clear message. These mountain people could take care of themselves, and they didn't need anyone's permission to do it. So, when North Carolina started making noises about what to do with its western lands, the people living there paid attention. Because they knew, from experience, that whatever decision got made in the capital would probably benefit someone back east and leave them to deal with the consequences. And they were right. The Cession Crisis, when North Carolina changed its mind. In early 1784, the North Carolina legislature was facing a problem. Actually, several problems, but the biggest one was money, or rather, the lack of money. The state was drowning in war debt, and the Continental Congress was politely but firmly suggesting that the states help pay for the shared costs of winning independence. One way to do that was to cede western lands to the federal government, which could then sell the land to settlers and use the proceeds to pay down the national debt. Several states had already done this. Virginia had ceded most of its claims to land north of the Ohio River. Other states were making similar offers. It seemed like the responsible, patriotic thing to do. But North Carolina hesitated, because while ceding the land would help the national cause, it would also mean giving up the state's most valuable asset. So the legislature came up with a creative and deeply cynical solution. In late 1783, they passed what became known as the Land Grab Act. This law opened up all of North Carolina's western lands, essentially everything west of the mountains, for sale to anyone who wanted to buy it. And the prices were low, very low, suspiciously low in fact, because the people setting the prices were also the people buying the land. Over the next several months, roughly 4 million acres were claimed. That's over 6,000 square miles, an area larger than Connecticut. And who bought this land? Members of the legislature, their business partners, their friends, their relatives. It was a spectacularly corrupt land rush, and everyone involved knew it. But it was technically legal, so the sales went through, and suddenly a small group of wealthy North Carolinians owned enormous chunks of the western frontier. The people actually living on that land, the settlers who had built cabins and cleared fields, were now tenants on property owned by speculators who had never set foot west of the mountains. Having secured their land claims, these same legislators then did something remarkable. In April 1784, they passed an act ceding all of North Carolina's western territory to the Continental Congress. The cession came with strings attached, of course. Most importantly, all existing land claims had to be honored, which meant that the speculators who had just bought millions of acres got to keep their claims, validated by the federal government, while also offloading the expensive burden of defending and administering the territory. It was a sweetheart deal, and they knew it. The Continental Congress received this offer with what we might call cautious interest. On one hand, acquiring western lands was exactly what they wanted. On the other hand, the terms were complicated and there were questions about whether North Carolina even had the right to make these deals. While Congress debated, news of the cession traveled west, slowly, carried by riders on horseback and passed from palmson's settlement to settlement. And when the settlers heard that North Carolina had essentially sold them to the federal government, their reaction was mixed. Some were relieved. They hoped the federal government would provide better protection from Native American raids than distant North Carolina had. Others were suspicious. What if Congress sold the land to Spain or France to pay war debts? What if they were all evicted? But before those fears could fully develop, something extraordinary happened. North Carolina held new legislative elections in the fall of 1784, and the political winds shifted. The Land Grab Act had been deeply unpopular with ordinary voters, and many of the legislators who had voted for it lost their seats. The new legislature, facing public outrage over the blatant corruption, decided to clean house. In October 1784, just 6 months after passing the Cession Act, North Carolina repealed it. The western lands were no longer being ceded to Congress. They were back under North Carolina's control, retroactively, as if the cession had never happened. Except it had happened, and word of it had already reached the frontier. And in the 5 months between the cession and its repeal, the settlers beyond the mountains had made a decision. If North Carolina didn't want them and Congress wasn't going to protect them, then they would protect themselves. They would form their own state, petition Congress for admission to the Union, and become the 14th state of the United States of America. They would call it Franklin, after Benjamin Franklin, and surely Congress would admit them once they saw how organized and serious they were. By the time the repeal of the cession reached the frontier, it was too late. The wheels were already in motion. The settlers had held their convention, declared their independence, and elected a governor. They were, for better or worse, committed to the idea of statehood. And North Carolina's response, when they learned what had happened, was basically, wait, what do you mean you're forming your own state? You can't do that. You're still ours. To which the frontiersman replied, watch us. Birth of a state. The Jonesboro Convention. On August 23, 1784, about 40 to 50 men gathered in Jonesboro, the largest settlement in Washington County. These weren't rabble-rousers or revolutionaries in the dramatic sense. They were county commissioners, militia officers, landowners, and respected community members. Men like John Sevier, already famous as a war hero, William Koch, a lawyer and politician, Landon Carter, a member of one of Virginia's most prominent families, who had moved west seeking opportunity. These were the frontier's version of civic leaders, and they were about to do something that had no clear legal precedent. The proximate cause for the meeting was North Carolina's cession of the western lands to Congress. When word reached the settlements that they'd been handed over to the federal government, there was genuine concern about what would happen next. Would Congress sell the land to foreign powers? Would they be left in legal limbo? The settlers wanted clarity, and they wanted protection, and it seemed increasingly clear that they weren't going to get either from North Carolina or Congress. So they decided to take matters into their own hands. The convention was relatively small and conducted with remarkable speed. Each militia district sent 2 representatives, elected by the local militia companies, which at the time functioned as the primary form of local governance. The delegates met at the Jonesboro Courthouse, a log building that served as the center of civic life. They debated for 2 days, reviewing their options and discussing the legal and practical implications of what they were about to do. And then they voted to declare themselves independent of North Carolina and begin the process of forming a new state. The document they produced, sometimes called the Jonesboro Declaration, was framed carefully. They didn't present themselves as rebels or secessionists. Instead, they argued that North Carolina's cession had effectively severed the ties between the state and its western counties, and that the settlers had a natural right to form their own government when left without representation or protection. It was a legalistic argument, and probably not a very strong one, but it gave them a veneer of legitimacy. They weren't rebelling, they insisted. They were simply filling a vacuum left by North Carolina's abandonment. The convention elected John Sevier as president, both of the convention and of the nascent state. This was an obvious choice. Sevier was probably the most popular man on the frontier, a hero of Kings Mountain, an experienced Indian fighter, and a natural leader. He was also, ironically, somewhat reluctant to get involved. Later letters would suggest that Sevier had to be persuaded to take on the role of governor, that he was initially hesitant about the whole statehood movement. But once committed, he threw himself into the task. The delegates also decided on a name, sort of. The original plan was to call the state Frankland, meaning land of the Franks, which was a reference to the free people who would live there. But someone, probably William Koch, suggested that calling it Franklin after Benjamin Franklin might help their cause. Franklin was, after all, one of the most respected men in America, a founding father, a diplomat, a scientist, a printer, a symbol of American ingenuity and success. If they named the state after him, maybe he would endorse them. Maybe his name alone would convince Congress to admit them as the 14th state. It was, in essence, early America's first attempt at celebrity branding. And like most attempts at celebrity branding, it didn't quite work out as planned. The convention then called for a second, larger convention to be held in December to draft a constitution and formally organize the government. They encouraged all 3 western counties, Washington, Sullivan, and Greene, to send delegates and to spread the word to any settlers living in the surrounding areas. They wanted this to be a unified movement, a genuine expression of the will of the frontier people. And to their credit, the response was enthusiastic. When December arrived, representatives from across the region gathered, ready to create something new. But first, they had to figure out what kind of state they wanted to be. John Sevier, the frontiersman governor. To understand the state of Franklin, you have to understand John Sevier, because Franklin's story is, in many ways, his story. He was the face of the movement, the leader who gave it credibility, and later, the man whose decisions would help bring about its downfall. So, who was John Sevier, and why did the frontier people trust him enough to make him their governor? Sevier was born in 1745 in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, the son of a farmer of Huguenot descent. His family, originally named Xavier, had fled France for England during the religious persecutions of Protestants, anglicized their name to Sevier, and eventually made their way to the American colonies. Young John received a basic education, married at 16, and started farming and running a tavern. He was, by all accounts, energetic, personable, and ambitious, the kind of man who was always looking for the next opportunity. In 1773, Sevier moved his family west to the Watauga settlements, part of the wave of migration into the trans-Appalachian frontier. He quickly established himself as a community leader, serving as one of the commissioners of the Watauga Association. When the Revolutionary War began, Sevier joined the local militia and proved to be a natural military leader. He fought in numerous skirmishes against Cherokee war parties, often leading small bands of men on raids deep into Cherokee territory in retaliation for attacks on settlements. It was brutal, violent work, and Sevier was good at it, which earned him the nickname Nolichucky Jack, after the river near his home. His finest moment came in October 1780 at Kings Mountain. A British force under Major Patrick Ferguson was marching through the backcountry, trying to rally loyalist support and intimidate patriots. The over-mountain men, frontiersmen from the western settlements, gathered a force of about 1,000 men and marched east to intercept Ferguson. Sevier commanded one of the main contingents. The battle itself was a masterpiece of irregular warfare. The frontiersmen, expert marksmen who had grown up hunting in the mountains, used the wooded terrain to their advantage, surrounding the British on a hilltop and picking them off from behind trees. Ferguson was killed, his force destroyed, and the British efforts to control the southern backcountry were dealt a devastating blow. Sevier returned home a hero. By 1784, when the Franklin movement began, Sevier was 38 years old, at the height of his physical and political power. He was a colonel in the North Carolina militia, a member of the Washington County Court, a major landowner, and by most accounts, one of the most widely respected men in the Western settlements. He had a reputation for bravery, decisiveness, and fairness. He was also, it should be noted, an aggressive land speculator who had purchased thousands of acres in the expectation that the frontier would grow, and his investments would pay off. He had a personal financial interest in the region's development, which complicated his motivations. When the Jonesboro Convention elected him president and, later, governor of Franklin, Sevier reportedly hesitated. He knew the venture was risky. If Franklin failed, he could be charged with treason by North Carolina. His property could be confiscated. His reputation, built over years of military service, could be destroyed. But he also knew that if he didn't lead the movement, it might fall apart, or worse, be led by someone less capable. And so he agreed, perhaps reluctantly, to become Franklin's first and only governor. His leadership style was hands-on and pragmatic. He traveled constantly between settlements, meeting with local leaders, resolving disputes, organizing militia companies, and generally trying to hold the fragile new state together through sheer force of personality. He negotiated with the Cherokee, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, always trying to expand Franklin's territory and protect its settlers. He corresponded with Congress, with North Carolina officials, and with anyone else who might help legitimize Franklin's existence. But Sevier had flaws, as historical accounts and contemporary criticisms suggest. He could be hot-tempered and impulsive. He was accused, probably fairly based on his extensive land holdings, of using his position to benefit his personal land claims. His relationships with the Cherokee were marked by violence and broken promises. And as Franklin's situation grew more desperate, he would make increasingly questionable decisions, including attempting to negotiate an alliance with Spain, which would ultimately lead to charges of treason. Still, for 4.5 years, John Sevier was Franklin. Given his central role and popularity, it's reasonable to conclude that without him, the state might well have collapsed within months. With him, it lasted long enough to make a real impact on the frontier, for better or worse. And when it finally fell apart, Sevier would land on his feet, as he usually did, and go on to become the first governor of Tennessee. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Government and the Battle of Constitutions. In December 1784, delegates from across the frontier territories gathered in Jonesboro for their second convention, this time with the serious task of drafting a constitution. And immediately, they ran into a problem that would plague Franklin for its entire existence. They couldn't agree on what kind of state they wanted to be. The first proposal came from Reverend Samuel Houston, a Presbyterian minister, and the uncle of the man who would later become famous as Sam Houston of Texas. Houston's proposed constitution, which became known as the Houston Constitution, was radical, even by frontier standards. It called for a unicameral, or single-chamber legislature, which was unusual for the time. It guaranteed religious freedom, which sounds modern and progressive, but it also included a moral code that required legislators to be practicing Christians who believed in the Trinity, heaven, and hell. Voters wouldn't need to own property to vote, which was remarkably democratic, but lawyers, doctors, and ministers couldn't hold office, which was remarkably suspicious of professional classes. The Houston Constitution also proposed that all major legislation be submitted to the people for public debate and approval before becoming law, a kind of direct democracy that was virtually unheard of in 18th century America. And perhaps most controversially, it suggested that Franklin should ban slavery, which would have made it the first Southern state to do so. The delegates debated the Houston Constitution for several days, and the discussion grew heated. Based on historical records of the convention, it appears that opinions were sharply divided. Some delegates embraced it as a fresh start, a chance to create a truly democratic society, free from the corruption and elitism of the eastern states. Others viewed it with skepticism, questioning the practicality of a government without lawyers, the economic impact of banning slavery when the entire Southern economy depended on it, or requiring public approval for every law. The debate over the Constitution revealed deep divisions within the Franklin movement. Historical evidence suggests that some delegates were true believers in radical democracy and Western independence, while others were more conservative, more interested in stability and legitimacy than in revolutionary ideals. Still others appear to have been primarily motivated by land speculation and personal gain, wanting a government that would protect their claims and keep the Cherokee at bay. In the end, the Houston Constitution was rejected. The vote was close, which showed how divided the delegates were, but reject it they did. The more conservative delegates, led by John Sevier, proposed instead that Franklin simply adopt North Carolina's constitution with some modifications. This was a much safer choice. North Carolina's constitution was known, tested, and respected. By adopting it, Franklin could claim continuity with established legal traditions, which might help their case for admission to the Union. So that's what they did. The final Franklin Constitution was basically North Carolina's constitution with a few tweaks. The biggest change was reducing property qualifications for voting and holding office, which made sense, given that most frontier settlers were land poor, but still wanted political participation. They kept the bicameral legislature, the governor's limited powers, and most of the standard procedures of state government. From a pragmatic standpoint, the rejection of the Houston Constitution likely helped Franklin's survival, at least in the short term. A state with such a radical constitution would have faced significant challenges gaining admission to the Union by Congress, and it might have deterred settlers and investors. But it also revealed that Franklin lacked a unifying vision. Was it a bold experiment in frontier democracy? Or was it just trying to be North Carolina's respectable Western cousin? That uncertainty would hang over Franklin for its entire existence. With a constitution finally adopted, the government got to work. They organized courts, appointed judges, created militia units, established counties, and began collecting taxes. On paper, Franklin looked like a real state. It had all the trappings of legitimate government. The problem was, none of it was actually legitimate in the eyes of North Carolina or Congress, and that fundamental lack of recognition would eventually prove fatal. But for now, in early 1785, Franklin was functioning. It was collecting taxes, holding court sessions, passing laws, and organizing itself into a proper state. The available evidence suggests substantial settler support. Records show people showed up to vote, served on juries, and paid their taxes, even if those taxes were in the form of animal skins rather than hard currency. Franklin was real, even if nobody else wanted to admit it. The quest for congressional recognition. For Franklin to succeed, it needed one thing above all else: recognition from the Continental Congress. Without it, Franklin was just a rogue territory playing dress-up as a state. With it, Franklin would be the 14th state, equal to the original 13, with representatives in Congress and the full protection of the federal government. So in early 1785, the Franklin government appointed William Cock, one of the architects of the independence movement, to travel to New York, where Congress was meeting, and petition for statehood. Cocky was a good choice for the job. He was educated, articulate, politically savvy, and had connections in the East from his time in Virginia. He understood how Congress worked, or at least how it was supposed to work under the Articles of Confederation, and he knew that timing would be critical. Congress was already dealing with the question of Western territories and how to admit new states. If he could present Franklin's case at the right moment, he might be able to slip them into the Union before anyone had time to object too strenuously. He arrived in New York in the spring of 1785 and immediately began lobbying. He met with delegates from various states, presented Franklin's credentials, and argued their case. The argument was straightforward. Franklin met all the reasonable requirements for statehood. It had a functioning government, a constitution, a population of settlers who wanted to be part of the Union, and most importantly, It occupied land that had been ceded to Congress by North Carolina. Therefore, Congress had every right to admit Franklin as a state, and doing so would strengthen the Union by bringing organized government to the frontier. Some delegates were sympathetic. Based on the voting patterns and contemporary correspondence, representatives from smaller states, particularly in New England, may have seen Franklin as a potential ally against the larger, more powerful southern states. The frontier settlements, they could have reasoned, might prove more democratic and egalitarian, less dominated by plantation aristocracy than the established southern states. Plus, admitting new states from Western territories was part of the plan for how America would grow. Thomas Jefferson had already proposed a system for creating new states from Western lands. Why not start with Franklin? But other delegates were skeptical or outright opposed. North Carolina's delegation, naturally, opposed Franklin's admission. They argued that North Carolina had never actually ceded the Western lands, or rather, that they'd taken back the cession before Congress had accepted it. So Franklin was essentially a rebellious movement within North Carolina's rightful territory. Admitting Franklin would be tantamount to Congress endorsing insurrection. And North Carolina had a point. The legal situation was genuinely murky. Had the cession been valid? Had North Carolina's repeal of the cession invalidated it? Did Congress have the authority to admit a state carved out of another state's territory without that state's consent? These were not trivial questions, and there were good faith arguments on both sides. Beyond the legal issues, there were practical concerns. Some Northern delegates worried that admitting Franklin would set a precedent for other breakaway movements. What if parts of Massachusetts or New York decided they wanted to be their own states? Where would it end? Other delegates were concerned about the balance of power between northern and southern states, or between large and small states. Every new state altered that balance, and nobody wanted to inadvertently strengthen their political opponents. When the vote finally came in May 1785, Franklin needed a 2/3 majority to be admitted under the Articles of Confederation. That meant 9 of the 13 states had to vote yes. William Koch had been working the delegates hard, calling in favors, making promises, presenting Franklin in the best possible light. And when the votes were counted, Franklin got 7: Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Georgia. 7 votes, too short. Franklin would not become the 14th state. The defeat was devastating, but not entirely unexpected. Koch reported back to Franklin that the vote had been close, and that he believed they could try again in a year or two once the political situation stabilized. In the meantime, he advised Franklin to keep governing, keep building up their population, and keep presenting themselves as a legitimate, functioning state. Eventually, he argued, Congress would have to recognize reality. But there was one more avenue to explore: Benjamin Franklin himself. The state was named after him, after all. Maybe if the great man himself endorsed them, it would sway Congress. So they wrote to Franklin, who was in France serving as ambassador. They explained their situation, their challenges, their hopes for the future. They flattered him, invoking his wisdom and his leadership. And they asked, politely but hopefully, for his support. Franklin's response, when it finally arrived months later, was diplomatic, courteous, and utterly unhelpful. He thanked them for the honor of naming the state after him. He wished them well in their endeavors. He noted that he had been out of the country and was not familiar with all the details of their situation, and he carefully avoided endorsing or condemning them. It was a masterclass in saying nothing while appearing to say something. Essentially, Franklin said, "I'm flattered. Good luck, but I'm not getting involved." The Franklinians had hoped for a founding father's blessing. They got a polite brush off. And so Franklin proceeded without federal recognition, without North Carolina's blessing, and without Benjamin Franklin's endorsement. It was a state in its own mind, but to the rest of the world, it was an interesting curiosity, a frontier oddity, a place that might become something if it survived long enough. Whether it would survive long enough was an increasingly open question. A government paid in skins, the barter economy. One of the most memorable and often mocked aspects of the state of Franklin was its decision to operate on a barter economy using animal skins as the primary form of currency. And before you laugh too hard at the image of a governor being paid in raccoon pelts, understand that this wasn't just some quirky frontier affectation. It was a practical response to a very real problem. Franklin had no money. Hard currency, meaning gold and silver coins, was scarce throughout the entire United States in the 1780s. The Continental Congress had printed paper money during the Revolutionary War, but by war's end, it was nearly worthless. The phrase, "not worth a continental," became slang for something valueless. Individual states printed their own paper money, but its value fluctuated wildly, and nobody trusted it very much. Add to that the fact that the frontier economy was almost entirely based on barter anyway. Settlers trading goods and services with each other because actual money was so rare. And Franklin's decision starts to make more sense. The Franklin legislature established an official schedule of payments for government officials, and it became one of the more entertaining artifacts of the lost state. According to the schedule, the governor was to receive an annual salary of 1,000 deerskins. The Secretary of State would get 500 raccoon skins. The treasurer received 450 otter skins. County clerks got 300 beaver skins. And so on, down through various offices and positions, each with its designated payment in furs. Now, these weren't literal payments. The idea wasn't that John Sevier would have a warehouse full of deerskins that he'd use to buy groceries. Rather, the skins represented units of value. A deerskin had a fairly stable trade value on the frontier. It could be sold to traders who would then ship the furs east or to Europe, where there was a market for American skins. So receiving payment in deerskins was, in theory, like receiving a paycheck that could then be converted into other goods, or, if you were lucky, actual money. In practice, the system was clunky and prone to abuse. The quality of skins varied wildly. Was a deerskin from a large healthy buck worth the same as a skin from a small doe? Who decided? What about skins that were poorly preserved or damaged? The system required a lot of trust and informal negotiation, which worked okay in small communities, where everyone knew each other, but broke down when dealing with larger scale transactions. And then there was the simple logistical challenge of dealing with hundreds or thousands of animal skins. They were bulky. They could rot if not properly preserved. They attracted vermin. and transporting them any distance was a hassle. Imagine trying to pay for a farm with 30 beaver pelts and 40 raccoon skins. Where do you store them? How do you transport them? What happens if some of them get wet and spoil? The whole system was a nightmare from an accounting perspective. But it's also worth noting that this wasn't unique to Franklin. Other frontier regions used similar systems. The difference was that Franklin codified it into their official government structure, making it part of the public record, and therefore part of the story we remember. It was honest, at least. It was a frank admission that this was a frontier territory without the resources of an established state, and that they were making do with what they had. The barter economy also reveals something important about Franklin's precarious position. A real state could levy taxes in money, issue currency, borrow against future revenue. Franklin couldn't do any of those things credibly because nobody believed Franklin would exist long enough to pay back loans or make good on currency. So they used what the land provided: animal skins, which had inherent value in the trade economy of the time. It was practical, it was pragmatic, and it was a constant reminder that Franklin was operating on the margins of legitimacy, one step away from just being a glorified frontier settlement. Still, the image endures. A state where the governor earned 1,000 deerskins a year. It's become part of Franklin's legend, a detail that makes it seem quaint and almost comically primitive. But for the people living through it, there was nothing funny about trying to build a government with no money, no credit, and no recognition. They made it work as best they could, one raccoon skin at a time. Treaties, broken promises, and Cherokee conflict. If Franklin's quest for recognition from Congress was a political failure, its dealings with the Cherokee Nation were a moral and practical disaster that would haunt the state throughout its existence and contribute directly to its eventual collapse. The fundamental problem was simple. Much of the land Franklin claimed as its territory was land that the Cherokee had never actually ceded, and the treaties Franklin negotiated to get that land were, at best, questionable, and, at worst, completely fraudulent. Let's back up and set the stage. The Cherokee Nation was one of the most powerful Native American confederacies in the Southeast, controlling large portions of what are now Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. They had a complex political structure with multiple towns and chiefs, and they'd learned through bitter experience that dealing with white settlers required careful negotiation and, when necessary, military resistance. During the Revolutionary War, the Cherokee had initially allied with the British, hoping that a British victory would halt American expansion into their territory. That gamble had failed, and now the Cherokee were dealing with the consequences. A flood of American settlers moving into their lands, and a new American government that claimed ownership of vast territories based on the Treaty of Paris. In 1785, representatives of the Cherokee Nation met with representatives of the Continental Congress at Hopewell, South Carolina, to negotiate a treaty that would define the boundaries between Cherokee lands and American settlement. The Treaty of Hopewell, signed in November 1785, established a boundary line that ran north of Greenville, the capital of the state of Franklin. The treaty guaranteed that land south of that line belonged to the Cherokee, and that American settlers would not encroach on it. The treaty was signed, ratified by Congress, and became the official policy of the United States government. There was just one problem. The settlers in Franklin had no intention of honoring it, and neither did John Sevier. Several months before the Treaty of Hopewell was negotiated, in June 1785, Sevier had met with a small group of Cherokee chiefs at Dumpling Creek and negotiated his own treaty. The Treaty of Dumpling Creek ceded a large area south of the French Broad River to the state of Franklin, opening it up for settlement. This was land the Cherokee had explicitly reserved for themselves in previous treaties. But Sevier convinced, or pressured, a few chiefs to sign it away. The problem was that the chiefs who signed the Treaty of Dumpling Creek didn't have the authority to speak for the entire Cherokee Nation. They were essentially rogue negotiators, and most Cherokee leaders rejected the treaty as invalid. But Sevier treated it as legitimate. He encouraged settlers to move into the newly ceded territory, and he established counties there. Sevier County, Blount County, Cock County. Settlers built cabins, cleared land, and started farms on land that, according to the Treaty of Hopewell, belonged to the Cherokee. The Cherokee, understandably, were furious. The conflict escalated. Cherokee war parties began raiding Franklin's settlements in the disputed territory, burning cabins, killing livestock, and sometimes killing settlers. Franklin's militia retaliated with raids on Cherokee towns. Sevier personally led several punitive expeditions deep into Cherokee territory, burning villages and destroying crops in a brutal cycle of violence that neither side seemed able to stop. In 1786, Sevier negotiated yet another treaty, the Treaty of Coyatee. This time, the negotiations took place at gunpoint. Sevier brought a militia force with him to the meeting and made it clear that the Cherokee chiefs could either sign the treaty or face immediate attack. Not surprisingly, they signed. The Treaty of Coyatee extended Franklin's claimed territory even further south to the Little Tennessee River, encroaching even more deeply into Cherokee lands. The United States government never ratified either the Treaty of Dumpling Creek or the Treaty of Coyatee. As far as Congress was concerned, these were illegal treaties negotiated by an unrecognized state with no authority to make such agreements. The only valid treaty was the Treaty of Hopewell. And by that treaty, the settlers in Franklin were trespassers. But from Franklin's perspective, they'd made legal agreements with Cherokee representatives, and they had every right to settle the land. This put the settlers in an impossible situation. Many of them had moved to the disputed territories in good faith, believing that Sevier's treaties were legitimate. They'd built homes, invested their labor and money in clearing land and planting crops. Now they were being told, by the federal government, that they had no legal claim to the land they were living on. Some packed up and left. Others dug in, figuring they'd been on the frontier long enough to know that possession was 9/10 of the law. And if they could hold the land through force, eventually someone would recognize their claims. The violence intensified through 1787 and 1788. Cherokee war parties struck settlements with increasing frequency. One particularly brutal raid on the Kirk family homestead resulted in 11 deaths, including women and children. Sevier responded with another military expedition, destroying several Cherokee towns in a campaign that was as much about revenge as military strategy. The cycle of raid and retaliation became the defining feature of life in Franklin's disputed territories, and it made the state increasingly untenable. Because here's the thing: settlers were coming to the frontier looking for land and opportunity, but they were also looking for safety and stability. A state that couldn't protect its citizens from constant raids wasn't a very attractive place to settle. And a state that was in open conflict with the federal government over its treaties with Native Americans wasn't a state that had much of a future. Potential settlers started looking elsewhere, to Kentucky or to other parts of the frontier where the land situation was less complicated. Franklin's population growth, which had been rapid in 1785 and 1786, began to slow. And without population growth, Franklin's chances of ever being admitted to the Union grew dimmer. The Cherokee conflict also isolated Franklin diplomatically. Congress wasn't going to admit a state that was violating federal treaties. North Carolina pointed to Franklin's treaty violations as evidence that the frontier people couldn't govern themselves responsibly. Even some of Franklin's own residents began to question whether the whole venture had been a mistake. And all the while, the violence continued, with no end in sight. Rival governments and the Sevier-Tipton feud. While Franklin struggled with external challenges, its biggest threat might have been internal, the fact that not everyone in the territory supported independence from North Carolina. In fact, a significant minority remained loyal to North Carolina throughout Franklin's existence, and they had their own government, their own courts, and their own militia. For several years, two parallel governments operated in the same territory, each claiming legitimacy, each trying to win the loyalty of the settlers, and each increasingly hostile to the other. And at the center of this conflict was the bitter personal rivalry between John Sevier and John Tipton. John Tipton was, in many ways, Sevier's equal, but opposite. He was also a Revolutionary War veteran, a respected military leader, and a prominent landowner. He'd fought at Kings Mountain alongside Sevier. He was intelligent, capable, and stubbornly principled. And from the very beginning, he opposed the Franklin movement. He believed it was illegal, impractical, and doomed to failure. When the Jonesboro Convention declared independence, Tipton refused to participate. When Franklin held elections, Tipton ran as a North Carolina loyalist. And when Franklin tried to enforce its authority, Tipton resisted, backed by a significant number of settlers who shared his views. North Carolina, seeing an opportunity to undermine Franklin, enthusiastically supported Tipton. They appointed him to the North Carolina Senate representing Washington County, even though Franklin also claimed Washington County and had its own representatives. They gave him authority to collect taxes, hold court sessions, and organize militia units in the name of North Carolina. They encouraged him to establish a rival government that would show the settlers that North Carolina was still the legitimate authority in the region. For several years, this absurd situation persisted. In the same county, two governments operated side by side. If you supported Franklin, you paid your taxes to Franklin's collectors, attended Franklin's courts, and followed Franklin's laws. If you supported North Carolina, you paid your taxes to Tipton's collectors, attended North Carolina's courts, and followed North Carolina's laws. The two sides raided each other's courthouses, seized each other's documents, and generally behaved like competing gangs claiming the same turf. The rivalry between Sevier and Tipton became intensely personal. There are accounts of them scuffling in the streets of Jonesboro, of angry confrontations at public meetings, of insults traded in letters and proclamations. Both men were proud, both were stubborn, and neither was willing to back down. Their supporters fed the rivalry, taking sides and treating the conflict like a blood feud. North Carolina's strategy was clever. By maintaining a visible loyalist government under Tipton, they made it impossible for Franklin to claim unanimous support from the frontier population. They created confusion and division that weakened Franklin from within. And they did it without having to send troops west, which would have been expensive and potentially disastrous, given how well the frontier people could fight when they wanted to. By 1787, the situation had reached a breaking point. Franklin's government was struggling. The expected recognition from Congress hadn't come. The Cherokee conflict was draining resources and driving away settlers. Tax collection was spotty because many people weren't sure which government they should pay, or if they should pay at all. And increasingly, settlers were defecting to the North Carolina side, either because they genuinely believed Tipton was right, or because they wanted to be on the winning side. And Franklin didn't look like winners anymore. The Sevier-Tipton rivalry would culminate in violence in early 1788, in an incident that would effectively end Franklin's chances of survival. But before we get to that, we need to understand just how desperate Franklin's situation had become. Because by 1788, John Sevier was willing to try almost anything to save his state, including betraying it to a foreign power. The Battle of Franklin. When neighbors became enemies. The final act of the state of Franklin's existence began with a petty act of tax collection and escalated into the only actual battle fought between two rival American governments on American soil during peacetime. It lasted about 10 minutes, killed 3 people, and effectively ended any remaining hope that Franklin would survive as an independent state. In February 1788, John Sevier was away from home, leading militia forces on yet another raid against Cherokee towns. While he was gone, North Carolina Sheriff Jonathan Pugh, acting on orders from John Tipton, went to Sevier's property to seize assets for unpaid taxes that Sevier supposedly owed to North Carolina. The assets in question were enslaved people, which Sevier owned, and which were considered, in the legal and moral framework of the time, valuable property subject to seizure for debt. Pugh took several of the enslaved people and brought them to Tipton's farm for safekeeping until the tax matter could be resolved. When Sevier returned and learned what had happened, he was furious. To have his property seized while he was away by a government he didn't recognize, on the orders of his political rival, was a direct insult and challenge to his authority. He immediately gathered about 150 Franklin supporters and marched to Tipton's farm, a log cabin located on land that is now part of Johnson City, Tennessee. His demand was simple: return the seized people, acknowledge Franklin's authority, or face the consequences. Tipton refused. He'd fortified his cabin in anticipation of trouble, and he had about 40 to 45 loyalists with him, enough to make storming the cabin a costly proposition. Sevier's men surrounded the cabin and settled in for a siege. For 2 days, February 27th and 28th, 1788, the two sides faced each other. Sevier sent flags of truce asking for Tipton's surrender. Tipton sent back messages saying the only solution was for Sevier and his followers to submit to North Carolina's authority. Occasionally shots were fired, but mostly both sides waited to see what would happen. On February 29th, the situation changed. A Sullivan County militia unit loyal to North Carolina, about 100 men under the command of Colonel Robert Love, arrived to reinforce Tipton. Suddenly the numbers were against Sevier. A brief, chaotic gunfight broke out. Accounts differ on what exactly happened, but most agree that both sides were reluctant to actually kill each other. These weren't foreign enemies. They were neighbors, former comrades in arms, people who had fought side by side against the British just a few years earlier. The idea of killing each other over a political dispute was, for most of them, abhorrent. Some accounts say that Tipton's men fired over the heads of the attackers, deliberately missing. Others say that Sevier's men shot at the corners of Tipton's cabin rather than at the people inside. Historians have described it as a fight where nobody really wanted to kill anybody, which makes the 3 deaths even more tragic. 2 of Tipton's men were killed, including Sheriff Jonathan Pugh, who died from a chest wound several days later. 1 of Sevier's men was also killed. Several others were wounded on both sides. After about 10 minutes of actual fighting, Sevier realized the situation was hopeless. He was outnumbered, his men were taking casualties, and reinforcements for Tipton might arrive at any moment. He ordered a retreat, and his forces scattered back to their homes. Several of Sevier's supporters, including 2 of his sons, were captured by Tipton's men. Tipton, enraged by the attack and the deaths of his men, initially demanded that the captured men be hanged as traitors. But cooler heads prevailed, and the prisoners were eventually released. The Battle of Franklin, as it came to be called, was a humiliating defeat for Sevier and for Franklin itself. It showed that Franklin couldn't even maintain control over its own territory against internal opposition. It made Sevier look reckless and desperate, and it gave North Carolina exactly the propaganda victory they needed. Look, they could say to Congress and to potential settlers, this is what happens when you let frontier rabble try to govern themselves. They turn on each other. They start shooting neighbors. This isn't a state, it's chaos. In the weeks following the battle, Franklin's support collapsed. Settlers who had been on the fence decided it was safer to align with North Carolina. County officials who had supported Franklin quietly switched sides. Even some of Sevier's closest allies began to distance themselves. The whole venture, which had seemed so promising in 1784, now looked like a tragic mistake. And for John Sevier, the worst was yet to come. The Spanish Intrigue and the final collapse. In the aftermath of the Battle of Franklin, with his government crumbling and his authority evaporating, John Sevier intensified his pursuit of a decision that would be used against him for years. Negotiations with Spain that had begun the previous year. He reached out more urgently to Spain for help, not just for assistance, but for a potential alliance that would have placed Franklin under Spanish protection. It was an act of desperation, and when it was discovered, it finished Franklin as a political entity and nearly finished Sevier as well. Here's the context. Spain controlled Louisiana, which meant they controlled the Mississippi River, and, by extension, access to the Gulf of Mexico. For frontier settlers, especially those in the Kentucky and Tennessee territories, access to the Mississippi was economically crucial. They produced goods, primarily agricultural products, that needed to get to markets, and the easiest route was down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and then by ship to the rest of the world. But Spain, nervous about American expansion, had closed the Mississippi to American trade. This was causing economic hardship throughout the Western territories, and there were growing whispers that maybe the frontier should break away from the United States and make some kind of deal with Spain. Sevier, facing the collapse of Franklin, Cherokee raids that he couldn't stop, and North Carolina's increasing pressure, began secret negotiations with Spanish officials in Louisiana. The Spanish minister, Diego de Gardoqui, had been reaching out to various American frontier leaders, testing their loyalty, trying to see if any would be willing to bring their territories under Spanish control in exchange for economic benefits and military protection. Sevier, through intermediaries, including James White, who would later be revealed as a paid Spanish agent, began to explore the possibility. The details are murky because both sides tried to keep the negotiations secret, but the basic outline is clear. Sevier suggested that Franklin, or at least parts of it, might be willing to separate from the United States and become a Spanish protectorate in exchange for trade access, military assistance against the Cherokee, and financial support. The Spanish were interested enough to continue talks, but they were also cautious. Sevier might be playing both sides, trying to use the threat of Spanish involvement to force Congress or North Carolina to recognize Franklin. Or he might be serious, in which case Spain would gain a foothold in territory the Americans claimed. When rumors of these negotiations began to leak, North Carolina officials were horrified. A Spanish client state on their western border? Absolutely not. And Congress, which had been reluctant to intervene in the Franklin situation because it was messy and complicated, suddenly had a clear reason to act. Foreign influence on American territory couldn't be tolerated. This was a matter of national security. In July 1788, North Carolina Governor Samuel Johnston issued a warrant for John Sevier's arrest on charges of treason. The charge was technically for his role in the Franklin movement and the attack on Tipton's property. But the Spanish intrigue was the real motivator. Sevier, realizing the danger, went into hiding in the rugged mountains of the region, protected by loyalists who still supported him. In October 1788, Sevier made a rare appearance in Jonesboro, perhaps thinking enough time had passed that he could move about safely. He went to a store owned by David Dederick and asked to buy whiskey. Dederick, a North Carolina loyalist, refused. A confrontation ensued. Details are hazy, but accounts suggest Sevier became aggressive, possibly even violent. Dederick sent word to Tipton that Sevier was in town. Tipton quickly gathered men and surrounded the building where Sevier was staying. Sevier surrendered without a fight. He was taken to Morganton, North Carolina, to stand trial for treason. If convicted, he could be executed. The frontier that had elevated him to hero status now watched to see if he would hang for his ambitions. But Sevier, as always, had friends. Burke County Sheriff William Morrison, a fellow veteran of Kings Mountain, arranged for Sevier to escape custody before the trial could begin. It's unclear if this was an official release or a jailbreak, but either way, Sevier was free and back in the Tennessee Territory, by the end of 1788. By this point, Franklin was effectively dead. The state's term as governor expired in March 1788, and the legislature, such as it was, never met again. Counties that had been part of Franklin were reverting to North Carolina's control one by one. Settlers were taking oaths of loyalty to North Carolina. The whole experiment had lasted 4.5 years, from August 1784 to early 1789, and now it was over. In February 1789, John Sevier walked into a Greene County courthouse and took an oath of allegiance to North Carolina. It must have been a bitter moment for the man who had tried to build his own state. But Sevier was nothing if not a survivor. He'd fought his last battle for Franklin and lost. Now he would make his peace with North Carolina and see what came next. North Carolina, to their credit, was surprisingly forgiving. Governor Alexander Martin pardoned Sevier for his role in the Franklin movement. He was even elected to the North Carolina Senate representing Greene County, the same county where he'd served as governor of Franklin. It was as if the state wanted to pretend the whole Franklin episode had never happened, and Sevier was willing to go along with that fiction. But the story wasn't quite over. The land Franklin had occupied wouldn't remain North Carolina's for long. In December 1789, North Carolina finally did what they'd tried to do in 1784. They permanently ceded their western lands to the federal government. This time, Congress accepted. In 1790, the territory was organized as the Southwest Territory, with William Blount, a North Carolina politician and land speculator, as governor. And in 1796, the territory had enough population to apply for statehood and was admitted to the Union as Tennessee, the 16th state. John Sevier, the man who had tried and failed to create the 14th state, became Tennessee's first governor. He served 6 terms, was wildly popular, and became a founding father of Tennessee, the state that Franklin had always wanted to be. It's one of history's little ironies. Sevier failed to create Franklin, but he succeeded in creating Tennessee, and he got to govern it anyway. Legacy, the lost state that almost was. So what do we make of Franklin, this brief, strange, ambitious experiment in frontier self-governance? Was it a noble attempt at democracy or a reckless rebellion? A bold vision for the future or a land grab dressed up in patriotic language? The answer, as with most things in history, is probably all of the above, depending on who you ask and what you emphasize. From one perspective, Franklin was an early example of American democratic impulses. The idea that people have a right to govern themselves, and that they don't need permission from distant authorities to form communities and create laws. The Franklin settlers weren't trying to leave the United States. They wanted to join it as equals. They just wanted recognition and respect for what they'd built. In that sense, Franklin was very American, almost aggressively so, an expression of the same spirit that had led to the Revolution in the first place. From another perspective, Franklin was a mess. It was poorly planned, legally questionable, and ultimately doomed by its own internal contradictions. It couldn't decide what it wanted to be, radical or conservative, democratic or traditional. It couldn't manage its relationship with the Cherokee, leading to years of violence that benefited no one. It couldn't maintain unity among its own people, leading to the creation of a rival government and an actual battle between neighbors. And it couldn't survive without recognition. which it never got. By any practical measure, Franklin failed. But failure doesn't mean irrelevance. Franklin mattered, both to the people who lived through it and to American history more broadly. For one thing, it exposed deep problems with the Articles of Confederation. The fact that Congress couldn't figure out what to do with Franklin, couldn't decide whether Western territories had the right to form their own states, couldn't mediate between Franklin and North Carolina. All of this showed how weak the federal government was under the Articles. It became one more piece of evidence that the Articles needed to be replaced with something stronger, which eventually happened when the Constitution was written in 1787. The Franklin episode also appears to have influenced the Constitution's provisions on statehood. Article 4, Section 3, which describes how new states can be admitted to the Union, includes language that scholars believe was almost certainly written with cases like Franklin in mind. It says that new states can be admitted by Congress, but that no new state can be formed within the jurisdiction of an existing state without that state's consent. That's the Franklin Clause. It exists because Franklin tried to form itself out of North Carolina without North Carolina's consent, and the framers wanted to make sure that situation couldn't happen again. Franklin also became a symbol, used differently by different people to make different points. For some, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of rebellion and the importance of respecting legitimate authority. For others, it was evidence of the frontier spirit, the American ability to create something from nothing, even if it didn't last. For Tennessee, it became a founding myth, a romantic story about the state's origins, conveniently forgetting the violence, corruption, and chaos that had characterized much of Franklin's existence. The physical traces of Franklin are sparse. Almost no official government records survived. The Capitol building in Greenville, where the state government met, was dismantled in the 1890s and taken to Nashville for Tennessee's centennial celebration. The logs were supposed to be returned and reassembled, but they never were. They were lost somewhere in Nashville, and nobody's sure where. It's fitting, in a way. The lost state of Franklin lost even its Capitol building. But the memory persists. Counties in eastern Tennessee still bear names that Franklin gave them. Sevier County, Greene County, Cocke County. Roads and buildings are named after the state and its leaders. Historical markers dot the landscape, pointing out where conventions were held, where battles occurred, where treaties were signed. And historians still debate what Franklin means and whether it deserved better than it got. John Sevier, as we noted, went on to greater things, becoming a Tennessee legend. John Tipton, his rival, also prospered, serving in Tennessee's state government and helping to write the state constitution. William Cocke, who had failed to get Franklin admitted to Congress, was elected as one of Tennessee's first U.S. senators. Many of the men who had been Franklinians ended up as Tennessee officials, suggesting that the whole episode was less a shameful rebellion than a rehearsal for actual statehood. And maybe that's the best way to understand Franklin. Not as a failed state, but as a practice run. The lessons learned during Franklin's brief existence about organizing government, managing frontier conflicts, negotiating with Native Americans, dealing with land claims and speculation. All of these lessons were applied when Tennessee was organized. Franklin was where Eastern Tennessee learned to govern itself, messily and imperfectly, but successfully enough that when the real opportunity for statehood came, they were ready. The lost state of Franklin was lost, but it wasn't wasted. It taught a young nation something about how not to handle Western expansion, which made later expansions smoother. It showed that frontier democracy could work, at least partially, which encouraged other territories to organize themselves. And it gave Tennessee an origin story that was uniquely its own, not borrowed from some colonial charter or granted by a king, but created by ordinary people trying to build something in the wilderness. In the end, Franklin lasted 4 years and 6 months, from August 23, 1784, when the Jonesboro Convention declared independence, to February 1789, when the last holdouts took oaths of loyalty to North Carolina. For a state that never officially existed, that's not bad. Most rebellions fail faster. Most separatist movements collapse within weeks or months. Franklin held on, adapting, fighting, negotiating, and sometimes just stubbornly refusing to admit defeat. And even though it ultimately lost, even though it became the lost state, it's remembered, which is more than most lost causes can say. So, there you have it. The story of Franklin, the almost 14th state, the forgotten republic, the frontier experiment that burned bright and brief before fading into memory and legend. A state that paid its governor in deerskins, fought a 10-minute battle with its own people, tried to ally with Spain, and somehow still managed to contribute something meaningful to American history. Franklin's story reminds us that the early United States was far more chaotic and uncertain than we sometimes remember. The boundaries between states, between legitimate government and rebellion, between loyalty and treason, these were not clear lines in the 1780s. They were muddy, contested, negotiable. And people like John Sevier and William Koch, and the thousands of settlers in the Tennessee Territory, were trying to figure out the rules as they went along, making it up, trying things that sometimes worked and sometimes failed spectacularly. It reminds us too that statehood isn't automatic, isn't guaranteed, isn't something that just happens because people want it. It requires recognition, legitimacy, political support, and often luck. Franklin had none of these things at the right time. But 7 years later, when North Carolina ceded the same territory and Congress was ready to act, Tennessee got them all. Same land, same people, different outcome. Timing is everything. And finally, Franklin's story reminds us to look at the forgotten corners of history, the movements that failed, the states that almost were, the people who tried ambitious things and didn't quite succeed, because their stories are just as much a part of how we got here as the stories of success and triumph. Franklin didn't become the 14th state, but the struggle to make it happen shaped Tennessee, influenced the Constitution, and left a mark on American history that hasn't quite faded, even after more than 2 centuries. If you enjoyed this journey into the lost state of Franklin, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment and let me know what other forgotten stories from history you'd like to explore. There are so many of them out there, waiting to be rediscovered. And if you found this relaxing, if it helped you drift off, or just gave you a pleasant hour or so learning about something strange and interesting, then I've done my job. Until next time, sleep well, dream of frontier rebellions and raccoon skin treasuries, and remember that history is full of stories like Franklin, places, and people who tried to be something more, who reached for the impossible, and who left behind something worth remembering, even in failure. Good night, everyone.